In the neurological intensive care unit, a particular kind of agonizing silence hangs in the air. It is not truly quiet. Instead, it is a terrifying symphony of mechanical breaths, hissing oxygen, and beeping heart monitors that remind you the only thing keeping your child alive is a wall of machines. When Vivian Kane stood over the shattered, unrecognizable body of her 19-year-old daughter Lila, she did not feel only grief. She felt a cold, calcifying rage. The official police report called it a necessary use of force during a hostile resistance. Yet the bruised, swollen face of her honor roll student told a profoundly different story. The Oakridge Police Department thought they had silenced a nobody, brushing her under the rug of their systemic corruption. They did not realize they had just awakened a mother who was about to burn their entire empire to the ground. Late one night, the phone rang. Vivian Kane, a senior neonatal nurse who had spent her life pulling fragile lives back from the brink, woke with the immediate, visceral dread that only a mother knows. Lila, her only child and a sophomore studying architecture at the State University, was supposed to be home from a late-night study group hours earlier. "Is this Vivian Kane?" The voice on the other end was clinical and detached. "Yes, who is this?" "This is Oakridge Memorial Hospital. You need to come down here immediately. Your daughter, Lila Kane, has been admitted. She's in critical condition." The drive to the hospital was a blur of neon streetlights and blinding panic. Vivian's hands gripped the steering wheel so hard her knuckles ached, her mind racing through 100 horrific scenarios, none of which came close to the reality waiting for her. When she burst through the emergency room doors demanding to see her daughter, she was met by a wall of scrubs and solemn faces. Dr. Bennett Mills, a colleague she had known for 10 years, pulled her aside. He could not meet her eyes. "Vivian, it's bad," Dr. Mills said, his voice trembling slightly. She suffered massive, blunt force trauma to the head and torso, severe cerebral hemorrhaging, 3 broken ribs, a shattered orbital bone, and a collapsed lung. We had to place her in a medically induced coma to stop the brain swelling. Vivian, she was beaten. Vivian felt the floor drop out from beneath her. Beaten? By who? Was she mugged? Where are the police? "The police brought her in," Dr. Mills whispered, looking nervously over his shoulder toward the waiting room. "Vivian, the police are the ones who did this." Pushing past him, Vivian marched into the ICU. Nothing could have prepared her for the sight. Lila, her bright, laughing girl with dreams of building sustainable housing in low-income neighborhoods, looked completely broken. A thick plastic tube was taped to her mouth, breathing for her. Her face was a horrific canvas of purple and black, swollen to twice its normal size. A heavy footstep behind her broke the silence. Vivian turned to see a broad-shouldered police officer leaning casually against the door frame. His uniform nameplate read C. Briggs. He was chewing gum, looking at Vivian with a mixture of boredom and veiled contempt. "You the mother?" Officer Colton Briggs asked, hooking his thumbs into his duty belt. "What did you do to my daughter?" Vivian's voice was dangerously low, a tremor of pure shock masking the rising fury. Briggs shrugged, his expression utterly devoid of empathy. "Your kid made some bad choices tonight, ma'am. We pulled her over for a broken taillight on Route 9. She became erratic, aggressive, refused to comply with lawful orders. When my partner and I tried to detain her, she went for my weapon. We had to use subduing force. It's unfortunate, but she brought it on herself." "A broken taillight?" Vivian stared at him, her chest heaving. "Lila weighs 120 pounds. She has never been in a fight in her life. You expect me to believe she attacked 2 armed police officers over a traffic stop? I don't expect anything, ma'am. I'm just telling you what's in the report," Briggs replied, his tone hardening. He stepped closer, towering over her, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate. Maybe you didn't know your daughter as well as you thought. Kids get into bad stuff, drugs, bad crowds. The investigation will show it was a clean stop. He turned and walked away, his boots echoing down the sterile linoleum hallway. Vivian looked back at Lila's still form. She reached out, gently holding her daughter's unbruised hand. In that moment, the terrified mother died, and a relentless force of nature was born. "I'm going to find out what they did to you, baby," Vivian whispered into the hum of the machines, "and I am going to make them pay." Soon after, the Oakridge Police Department had mobilized its PR machine, and the cover-up was in full swing. Vivian sat in her living room watching the local news broadcast. On the screen stood Police Chief Garrett Monroe, a silver-haired, politically connected veteran of the force, flanked by Captain Derek Hayes and a representative from the police union. "The Oakridge Police Department is committed to transparency and the safety of our community," Chief Monroe droned into the microphone, looking deeply solemn. "Regarding the incident involving 19-year-old Lila Kane, preliminary internal reviews indicate that Officers Briggs and Lang acted strictly within departmental guidelines. The suspect exhibited extreme hostility under what we suspect may have been the influence of illicit narcotics and posed an immediate lethal threat to the officers on the scene." A reporter shouted from the press pool. "Chief Monroe, the family is stating the injuries are inconsistent with a standard subduing technique. They allege severe police brutality. Will you release the body cam footage of the arrest?" Monroe did not blink. "Unfortunately, due to a highly unusual technical malfunction with our server sync that evening, the body cam footage from both officers was corrupted. However, we have recovered audio fragments that corroborate the officers' accounts of the suspect screaming and resisting." Vivian threw her coffee mug at the television. It shattered against the wall, a dark stain dripping down the paint. Corrupted, the most convenient word in the police dictionary. The media assassination followed immediately. Anonymous police sources leaked to the press that Lila had a prior record. It was a juvenile citation from when she was 15 for being at a high school party where alcohol was present, a charge that had been expunged. But on the news, it was twisted to paint her as a troubled youth with a history of defiance. They were building a narrative piece by piece to justify nearly beating a teenager to death. Vivian hired a lawyer, a sharp but overworked civil rights attorney named Julian Sterling. Julian sat at her kitchen table looking over the sparse official reports with a grim expression. "Vivian, I need to be brutally honest with you," Julian said, rubbing his temples. "This department is notoriously corrupt, and Chief Monroe has the mayor and the judges in his pocket. Without that body cam footage, it's Lila's word against two decorated officers. And Lila can't speak right now." "So we just let them get away with attempted murder?" Vivian asked, her voice tight. "I'm filing a preservation order for all dispatch logs, GPS vehicle data, and personnel files," Julian replied. "But they will stonewall us. They'll tie this up in court for years, hoping you run out of money and give up. They are relying on you feeling helpless." "They picked the wrong mother," Vivian said. She realized then that playing by their rules would get her nowhere. If the system was designed to protect the predators, she had to dismantle the system from the outside. She needed evidence that could not be redacted by a police captain or dismissed by a bought and paid for judge. She started with the scene of the crime. According to the police report, the traffic stop occurred on the corner of Industrial Avenue and 4th Street, an abandoned warehouse district on the edge of town. It was a strange route for Lila to take. She should have been on the interstate coming home from the university. Why was she out there that night? Armed with a heavy flashlight and a cold determination, Vivian drove out to the industrial park. The area was desolate, lit only by flickering amber street lamps. Empty warehouses with shattered windows loomed in the dark. She parked exactly where the report stated Briggs's cruiser had stopped. She walked the asphalt looking for anything, skid marks, blood, a piece of torn clothing, but the street sweepers had already been through. The police had sanitized the scene perfectly. Vivian stood in the middle of the road, looking around in a slow 360-degree circle. The police cruisers did not have functioning dash cams and the body cams were corrupted, but this was the 21st century. Someone, somewhere, is always watching. Her eyes scanned the facades of the decaying buildings, mostly empty husks, but across the intersection, nestled between a boarded-up textile mill and a chain-link fence, sat an old, rusted auto salvage yard, Whitaker's Towing and Scrap. Mounted high on a rusted corrugated iron pole, barely visible in the shadows, was a small, weather-beaten security camera. It was pointed directly at the intersection. Vivian's heart hammered against her ribs. The police had either missed it in the dark or assumed it was a dummy camera for a defunct business. The next morning, she was going to find out. The bell above the door of Whitaker's Towing and Scrap jingled a harsh, metallic note as Vivian walked in the next morning. The office smelled of stale tobacco, motor oil, and old paper. Behind a counter cluttered with spark plugs and invoices sat Arthur Whitaker, a man who looked like he had been constructed out of beef jerky and wire. "We're closed to the public," Arthur grunted, not looking up from a carburetor he was tinkering with. "Mr. Whitaker, my name is Vivian Kane. My daughter was severely beaten by police officers right outside your gates on that night." Arthur froze. He slowly set down his wrench and looked up, his eyes narrowing beneath bushy gray eyebrows. "I saw the news. They're saying she attacked them." "They're lying," Vivian said, stepping up to the counter. "She's in a coma. They almost killed her. I noticed you have a camera on that pole outside. I need to know if it works, and I need to see what it recorded." Arthur let out a long, raspy sigh, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. He looked nervous, his eyes darting toward the window. "Look, lady, I don't want any trouble with the OPD. Briggs and Lang, they ain't regular cops. They run this district like a cartel. They find out I helped you, my business burns down mysteriously in the night, or worse." Vivian leaned in, her voice dropping to a plea that was entirely raw and broken. "My daughter might never wake up. She's 19. I don't have a husband. I don't have a big family. Lila is my entire world. Please, if there is any humanity left in this town, please help me." Arthur stared at her for a long, heavy moment. The silence in the dusty shop was deafening. Finally, he cursed under his breath, tossed the rag onto the counter, and walked into the back office. "Lock the front door and pull the blinds down," he called out. Vivian did as she was told and hurried into the back room. Arthur was booting up a dust-covered desktop computer. "The camera's old, black and white, no audio," Arthur muttered, clicking through a clunky interface. "But it runs 24/7 on a loop. Overwrites every week." "That night, you said?" "Yes." Arthur dragged the slider back. The screen showed the grainy, static-laced intersection. A small sedan, Lila's Honda, rolled into the frame and stopped at the red light. A moment later, an unmarked black SUV aggressively cut off the Honda, boxing it in. Two figures stepped out. Even in the grainy footage, Vivian recognized Briggs's hulking silhouette and the slimmer build of his partner, Travis Lang. "That ain't a traffic stop," Arthur whispered, leaning closer to the screen. The officers didn't approach Lila's window. Instead, they walked over to the trunk of their own SUV. Lang opened it, and Briggs pulled out a heavy duffel bag. Another car, a sleek luxury sedan with tinted windows, pulled into the intersection from the opposite direction. A man stepped out, handing Briggs a thick envelope in exchange for the duffel bag. "My God," Vivian breathed. "They were making a drop, drugs or money, and your kid was sitting right there at the red light," Arthur said grimly. On the screen, Lila could be seen in the driver's seat. The glow of her smartphone illuminated her face. She was holding it up against the windshield. She was recording them. Vivian gasped. Lila saw the exchange, and she filmed it. Briggs noticed the flash of the phone screen. The footage showed him violently pointing toward Lila's car. The luxury sedan sped off instantly. Briggs and Lang drew their weapons and sprinted toward the Honda. What followed was a nightmare captured in 30 frames per second. Lang shattered the driver's side window with the butt of his gun. Briggs reached in, unlocked the door, and violently yanked Lila out of the car by her hair. Lila hit the pavement hard. She scrambled to hold onto her phone, but Lang kicked her in the ribs, sending the device skittering across the asphalt. Lila raised her hands in total surrender, curling into a ball on the ground, but the officers did not stop. Briggs struck her in the face with his heavy Maglite flashlight. Once, twice. Lang drove his knee into her back. The beating was systematic, relentless, and completely unprovoked. It went on for nearly 3 minutes. Vivian stood frozen, tears streaming silently down her face, her hand covering her mouth to stifle a scream. She was watching her child be tortured. Eventually, Lila stopped moving entirely. Briggs casually walked over, picked up Lila's phone from the street, and slipped it into his pocket. Lang dragged Lila's limp body toward her car, leaving her slumped against the tire before finally calling it in on his radio. The video ended. Arthur sat back in his chair, visibly pale. Jesus Christ, they murdered her. Not yet, Vivian whispered, wiping the tears from her face. The sorrow was gone, completely consumed by an inferno of purpose. Arthur, I need a copy of this video right now. I'm burning it to a flash drive, Arthur said, his hands shaking as he worked the computer. But Vivian, you take this to the local DA, they'll bury it. The district attorney plays golf with Chief Monroe every Sunday. They'll say the video is doctored, or they'll just make the flash drive disappear in evidence. I know, Vivian said, taking the silver flash drive from him and gripping it so tightly it dug into her palm. I'm not taking it to the police. I need Lila's phone. Briggs took it because he knew it had the high-definition footage of their drug deal. That phone is the key to bringing down the whole department. How are you going to get a phone out of an evidence locker or a dirty cop's house? Arthur asked, looking at her like she was a ghost. Vivian's eyes were cold, calculating. I'm going to find the weakest link in their armor, and I'm going to break it. As she walked out of the scrapyard, the morning sun was just beginning to break over the city of Oakridge. Vivian Kane had the truth in her pocket. Now she needed a weapon, and she knew exactly where to start. Officer Travis Lang. Briggs was a sociopath, but Lang had hesitated for a split second on that tape before joining the beating. Lang was scared, and scared men make mistakes. The sterile, fluorescent hum of the hospital was Vivian's domain. For 20 years she had navigated its corridors, memorizing its blind spots and back channels. If the Oakridge Police Department had a monopoly on violence, Vivian had a monopoly on secrets. People forget that nurses see everything. The broken bones, the blood work, the insurance denials, the private tragedies that drive people to do desperate things. Officer Travis Lang was a desperate man. Vivian spent 2 sleepless nights digging. She did not sleep. She survived on black coffee and a maternal adrenaline that burned like battery acid. Using a borrowed administrative login from a sympathetic night shift clerk, she accessed the hospital's master patient index. She cross-referenced Lang's name, looking for a vulnerability. She found it under his wife's name, Chloe Lang. Chloe had been admitted 3 times in the last 6 months for aggressive, advanced stage, multiple sclerosis. The notes from the billing department painted a grim picture. Their health insurance had capped out. The experimental therapies keeping Chloe out of a wheelchair cost upwards of $10,000 a month out of pocket. That is why he took the dirty money, Vivian realized, staring at the glowing monitor. That is why he did not stop Briggs. It did not excuse him, not for a second, but it gave Vivian the leverage she needed. One rainy evening, Vivian waited in her car across the street from the Langs' modest suburban home. A marked cruiser pulled into the driveway. Travis Lang stepped out, looking exhausted. His shoulders were slumped, his uniform wrinkled. He did not look like the untouchable enforcer who had shattered her daughter's ribs. He looked like a man slowly drowning in his own life. Vivian waited until he went inside, gave it 20 minutes, and then walked up to the front door. She did not knock. She rang the doorbell, a sharp, cheerful chime that felt entirely out of place. The door opened. Lang stood there in a faded t-shirt and sweatpants, holding a half-empty beer. When his eyes focused on Vivian's face, a face he had seen crying in the ICU just days prior, the color instantly drained from his cheeks. The beer bottle slipped a fraction of an inch in his grip. "Mrs. Kane," he breathed, his voice barely a rasp. "Hello, Travis," Vivian said. Her voice was ice. "Invite me in, or I can stand on your porch and scream to your neighbors about how you and Colton Briggs beat a 19-year-old girl into a coma to cover up a felony drug syndicate." Lang looked panicked, glancing over his shoulder into the house. "You need to leave. You can't be here. My wife is sick." "I know all about Chloe," Vivian interrupted, stepping forward so the toe of her shoe crossed the threshold. "I know about the MS. I know about the unpaid medical bills at Oakridge Memorial. And I know how you suddenly managed to pay off $30,000 in arrears the day after you nearly killed Lila." Lang's jaw clenched. He opened the door wider, defeated, and gestured for her to step into the dimly lit hallway. "Chloe is asleep upstairs," he whispered frantically. "Please, keep your voice down." Vivian walked into the living room. It was painfully ordinary. Family photos lined the mantel. A pair of women's orthopedic shoes sat by the sofa. "I don't have time for a conscience, Travis, and neither do you," Vivian said, turning to face him. She reached into her purse and pulled out a stack of 8x10 glossy photographs. She tossed them onto the coffee table. They were high-resolution stills, printed from Arthur Whitaker's flash drive. The first showed Briggs handing over the duffel bag to the luxury sedan. The second showed Lang smashing Lila's window. The third was a horrifying, undeniable shot of Lang's boot connecting with Lila's spine as she curled on the asphalt. Lang collapsed onto the sofa, burying his face in his hands. A ragged, pathetic sob tore out of his throat. Briggs said she was a scout for a rival dealer. He said she pulled a weapon. It happened so fast. I didn't know what we were doing until it was already happening. "Don't you dare lie to me," Vivian hissed, leaning over him. "She recorded the drop. You beat her to destroy the evidence and you took the phone." "I didn't take it. Briggs took it," Lang cried, looking up with bloodshot, terrified eyes. "I wanted to call an ambulance immediately. He wouldn't let me. He said we had to get our story straight. He kept the phone to wipe it, but he couldn't crack the passcode. He's holding on to it until his tech guy from the city comes down soon to format it." "Where is it?" "Vivian, please," Lang begged. "If Briggs finds out I talked to you, he'll kill me. He'll kill Chloe. You don't understand who he answers to. It's not just the chief, the man in that sedan, the buyer." Lang swallowed hard. "That was Judge Everett Foley. They run the seizure auctions. They steal cartel cash and narcotics from evidence, and Foley launders it through dummy real estate corporations." Vivian felt a chill radiate through her chest. Judge Foley was the most powerful magistrate in the county. He was the one who signed the warrants. He was the one who dismissed complaints against the police. The corruption was not just a few bad apples. The entire tree was rotten to the roots. "I don't care if it's the President of the United States," Vivian said, her voice dropping to a deadly calm. "Where's my daughter's phone?" "Briggs's hunting cabin," Lang whispered, completely broken. "Up on Blackwood Ridge. He has a wall safe hidden behind the gun rack. He bragged about it. He put the phone in there." "Give me the address and the code to the gate." I don't know the safe combination, Lang pleaded. It's an old mechanical dial, but it's reinforced. Lang grabbed a pen from the end table and scribbled an address on a receipt. He handed it to her, his hand shaking violently. If you go up there and he catches you, he will bury you in those woods, Vivian. No one will ever find you. Vivian took the paper, folded it neatly, and placed it in her pocket. If Lila dies, I'm already dead. I have nothing left to fear. She looked down at him with absolute disgust. You have 2 days to take your sick wife and get out of this state. Because when I burn this department to the ground, I won't care who gets caught in the flames. Blackwood Ridge was a drive outside the city limits, a dense, unforgiving expanse of pine trees and winding, unpaved logging roads. The rain that had started in the suburbs turned into a torrential downpour by the time Vivian's tires crunched onto the gravel of Briggs's private driveway. According to the shift schedule she had memorized, Briggs was currently working the graveyard shift. He would not be off until early morning. She had a window of time. The cabin was a sprawling, arrogant structure of dark timber and riverstone, sitting isolated at the edge of a ravine. There were no neighbors for miles. Vivian parked her car a half-mile down the road, hiding it behind a thicket of overgrown blackberry bushes. She hiked the rest of the way in the freezing rain, dressed entirely in black, carrying a heavy canvas duffel bag. Inside were tools she had procured from the hospital's maintenance closet: a heavy-duty crowbar, a cordless industrial drill, titanium bits, and a portable battery pack. She approached the back of the cabin. The security system was sophisticated, but Lang had given her the bypass sequence for the exterior panel. She punched in the numbers, holding her breath. A tiny green light blinked. The alarm was disabled. Using the crowbar, she forced the lock on the heavy oak back door. It splintered with a loud crack that echoed like a gunshot over the sound of the rain. She froze, listening. Nothing but the wind howling through the pines. She slipped inside, clicking on a small, red-filtered flashlight. The interior of the cabin smelled of stale cigars, leather, and gun oil. Animal heads stared down at her from the walls with glass eyes. It was a monument to killing. Vivian moved methodically, sweeping the beam across the living room until she found it. A massive, custom-built wooden gun rack displaying half a dozen high-powered rifles. Lang had said the safe was behind it. She gripped the edge of the heavy wooden rack and pulled. It swung open on hidden hinges, revealing a solid steel wall safe embedded directly into the stone chimney. It was an old-school mechanical dial safe, just as Lang had described. A brute force entry on a solid steel door would take hours, maybe days without explosives. But Vivian was not trying to open the door. She was a nurse. She understood anatomy. If you cannot go through the bone, you go through the soft tissue. She ran her flashlight around the edges of the safe where it met the stone chimney. The mortar holding the safe in place was thick, but it was not steel. Vivian pulled the heavy-duty drill from her bag. She attached a thick masonry bit. If she could drill out the mortar surrounding the locking bolts on the side, she might be able to wedge the crowbar in and warp the frame enough to pop the door. She pressed the drill against the stone and pulled the trigger. The noise was deafening in the empty cabin, a high-pitched, grinding scream of metal biting into rock. Stone dust flew into her face, coating her eyelashes and mixing with the sweat on her forehead. Minutes passed. Her arms screamed with lactic acid burn, but she did not stop. Every time she felt her strength failing, she pictured Lila's bruised, swollen face connected to those breathing tubes. The rage fueled her muscles, pushing her past human exhaustion. Finally, the drill punched through. She had created a gap between the safe and the stone housing. Vivian dropped the drill, grabbed the crowbar, and wedged the flattened end deep into the newly drilled hole. She planted her feet against the stone wall, gripped the iron bar with both hands, and threw her entire body weight backward. The metal groaned. The muscles in Vivian's back tore and popped, but she did not let go. She pulled with the strength of a mother fighting for her child's life. With a sickening crack, the steel frame warped. The internal locking bolts slipped free of their housing, and the heavy door popped open an inch. Vivian fell backward onto the hardwood floor, gasping for air. She scrambled back to her feet, her hands bleeding and raw, and pulled the safe door fully open. Inside sat stacks of $100 bills wrapped in rubber bands, a few velvet jewelry boxes, and several Ziploc bags filled with white powder. But Vivian ignored all of it. Sitting on the top shelf, next to a backup service weapon, was a pale pink smartphone with a cracked screen protector, Lila's phone. Vivian snatched it up, her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She plugged the phone into her portable battery pack. For agonizing seconds, the screen remained black. Then the white Apple logo appeared. "Please," Vivian prayed silently. "Please let the video be there." The phone booted up to the lock screen. It required Lila's 6-digit passcode. Vivian knew it instantly. It was her own birthday combined with Lila's. The phone unlocked. Vivian went straight to the camera roll. The most recent file was a video from that night. She pressed play. The video was shot from the dashboard mount of Lila's car, recording in crystal clear 4K resolution. It captured everything. The audio was pristine. "What is going on?" Lila's voice whispered from the phone speaker, sounding terrified. "Why are they blocking me?" Through the windshield, the video showed Briggs and Lang opening the trunk. It showed Judge Everett Foley stepping out of the luxury sedan under the glare of the street lamp. His face was perfectly illuminated. "Judge Foley, a player." Briggs's voice rang out clearly on the recording. 50 keys of the cartel seizure, just like we discussed. The chief expects his 20% by the end of the week. "It's in the trunk, Colton. Just make sure the evidence log shows it was incinerated," Judge Foley replied, handing over the thick envelope. Then the video captured the moment Briggs turned and saw Lila's car. It captured his face contorting into rage. It captured Lang smashing the window, the terrifying screams of her daughter, and the brutal, sickening sounds of the assault as the phone fell to the floorboards, continuing to record the audio of the beating until Briggs picked it up and ended the video. Vivian clutched the phone to her chest, her whole body shaking with a violent mixture of horror and absolute triumph. She had them. She had the chief of police, the most powerful judge in the county, and the men who broke her daughter. It was an airtight, undeniable confession recorded in high definition. She zipped the phone into her waterproof jacket pocket, grabbed her duffel bag, and turned to leave. Suddenly, the gravel outside crunched. Headlights swept across the living room windows, casting long, frantic shadows across the floor. A vehicle had just pulled into the driveway. Vivian froze. Briggs was home early. Panic seized Vivian's throat. There was no back exit from the living room. The only way out was the front door where Briggs was currently turning the key, or the kitchen, which led back to the splintered oak door she had broken to get in. She sprinted for the kitchen just as the front door swung open. "Who the hell is in here?" Briggs roared, his hand instantly going to his holster. He saw the beam of her flashlight sweep across the wall. Vivian did not look back. She bolted through the kitchen, her boots slipping on the polished wood. She hit the splintered back door with her shoulder, bursting out into the freezing rain and the pitch-black night. "Stop right there," Briggs bellowed from inside the cabin, drawing his weapon. Vivian scrambled off the back porch, plunging blindly into the dense, muddy tree line of Blackwood Ridge. She heard Briggs curse violently behind her as he discovered the warped, open safe. "I'm going to kill you." His voice echoed through the ravine, a sound of pure, unhinged fury. Gunfire erupted. A bullet slammed into a pine tree mere inches from Vivian's head, showering her with bark and splinters. She ducked low, letting the darkness and the torrential rain swallow her as she ran for her life, clutching the instrument of their destruction tightly to her chest. The hunt had begun, but Briggs did not realize he was not the predator anymore. He was the prey. The forest was a pitch-black labyrinth of jagged branches, freezing mud, and driving rain. Vivian scrambled down the steep embankment of the ravine, her boots sliding uncontrollably on the slick pine needles. Behind her, the rhythmic, heavy thud of Briggs's boots signaled a terrifying reality. He knew these woods. He was a hunter, and she was bleeding, exhausted, and running entirely on the fumes of maternal adrenaline. "You're not making it to the highway." Briggs's voice boomed through the trees, warped by the howling wind. Another gunshot rang out. The muzzle flash momentarily illuminated the timberline. The bullet struck a boulder to her left, sending a shower of razor-sharp stone shrapnel across her cheek. Vivian bit down on her lip to keep from screaming. She could taste copper in her mouth. She kept moving, clutching her waterproof jacket tightly against her chest to protect Lila's phone. Then she saw it. A faint red beam slicing through the darkness, sweeping methodically across the trunks of the pines. A laser sight. Worse, Briggs was carrying a high-powered rifle equipped with a thermal imaging scope. In the freezing rain, Vivian's body was glowing like a beacon on his screen. Running in a straight line was a death sentence. Vivian's clinical mind, trained to remain calm while arteries sprayed and monitors flatlined, took over. She needed to mask her heat signature. She remembered crossing a shallow, fast-moving creek about a quarter-mile back when she was hiking to the cabin. She veered sharply to the right, plunging into a dense thicket of thorns that tore at her clothes and skin. She did not feel the pain. She heard the rush of water before she saw it. Without hesitating, Vivian slid down the muddy bank and waded chest-deep into the glacial rushing water of Blackwood Creek. The shock of the cold was a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs and sending a million needles into her skin. She forced herself to crouch low, submerging her shoulders and neck, keeping only her face above the surface, sheltered under the overhanging roots of an ancient oak tree. Moments later, Briggs appeared on the bank. He was a terrifying silhouette against the storm, holding the rifle to his eye. He swept the thermal scope back and forth across the creek bed. Vivian held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs so violently she was terrified the water would ripple. The icy water was rapidly dropping her core temperature, blending her thermal output with the freezing environment. Briggs stood there for an agonizing minute. He lowered the rifle, cursing violently, kicking a heavy stone into the water. "I will find you," he roared to the empty woods. He turned and began marching back up the ridge, likely assuming she had circled back toward the logging road. Vivian waited until her limbs went completely numb and her vision began to blur at the edges from hypothermia. Only then did she drag her trembling, freezing body out of the water. She stumbled the remaining distance to her hidden car, driven by pure mechanical will. When she collapsed into the driver's seat, she locked the doors, blasted the heater, and plugged Lila's phone into the dashboard to ensure it did not die. She knew she could not take this to the local Oakridge FBI field office. If Judge Foley was laundering cartel money through the police department, the rot could easily extend to the local federal agents. She needed an entity entirely outside of the city's jurisdiction. She needed a nuclear option. Vivian pulled out her own laptop from the back seat and connected it to her cellular hotspot. Her fingers were stiff and blue, barely able to type, but the fire in her eyes was inextinguishable. She did not just upload the video to a cloud server. She built an email distribution list that would ignite a firestorm. To make the story undeniably reliable and impossible to cover up, she targeted heavyweights. She addressed the email to a prominent civil rights attorney named Elijah Grant, who had built a career destroying corrupt police departments. She added a Pulitzer-winning journalist named Wesley Thorne, known for his relentless data reporting on police use of force. She included the direct tip lines for the New York Times, CNN, the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division in Washington, D.C., and a decentralized international activist collective known for doxing corrupt officials. The subject line was simple: Oakridge PD attempted murder and cartel laundering. Confession video attached. She attached the 4K video file from Lila's phone, along with high-resolution photos of the financial ledgers she had snapped inside Briggs's safe and the exact GPS coordinates of the cabin. She hit the upload button. The progress bar filled slowly. Suddenly, the night lit up with blinding red and blue strobe lights. 3 Oakridge police cruisers roared down the logging road, blocking her car in. Briggs had radioed his shift commanders. The cavalry had arrived. Officers poured out of the vehicles, weapons drawn, shining, blinding spotlights into Vivian's windshield. "Step out of the vehicle with your hands up. Do it now," a voice commanded over a megaphone. Vivian did not move. She stared at the progress bar on her laptop screen. The glass shattered inward as an officer smashed his baton against her driver's side window, showering Vivian with glittering shards. A heavy hand grabbed her by the wet jacket, hauling her violently out of the driver's seat and slamming her face first into the freezing mud of the road. She felt a knee drive into her spine, the exact same way they had done to Lila. Cold steel cuffs ratcheted tightly around her wrists, cutting into her skin. "Got her," a cop sneered, pulling her head up by her hair. "Chief Monroe said to bring her to the precinct holding cell. No cameras." Vivian spat a mouthful of mud onto the officer's boots. She looked up at the shattered window of her car, straight at the glowing screen of her laptop on the passenger seat. A small green check mark had appeared. Message sent. Vivian smiled, a chilling, bloody grin that made the arresting officer take a subconscious step back. "Take me wherever you want," she whispered. "By sunrise, none of you are going to have a precinct to bring me to." As dawn broke, the city of Oakridge did not just wake up. It detonated. The digital payload Vivian had deployed from the freezing front seat of her shattered car hit the internet with the force of a tectonic shift. It began in the early hours when Wesley Thorne, a journalist whose career was built on dismantling systemic police abuse, opened his encrypted inbox. Soon after, he had verified the digital signatures on the 4K video. Before long, civil rights titan Elijah Grant was on a conference call with the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division in Washington, D.C. When the sun finally crested the horizon, casting long gray shadows over the Oakridge Police Department, the video of Vivian Kane being brutally beaten while a sitting judge purchased cartel narcotics had amassed millions of views. It was the #1 trending topic globally. The servers for the local city government crashed under the sheer volume of incoming traffic. But inside the subterranean holding cells of the Oakridge precinct, a heavy, ignorant silence reigned. Vivian sat perfectly still on a freezing, bolted-down metal bench. Her clothes were soaked through with swamp water and mud. Her wrists were bruised raw by the iron handcuffs, and a jagged cut on her cheek was crusted with dried blood. She had been denied a phone call, denied medical attention, and denied even a cup of water. In the morning, the heavy steel door at the end of the cell block groaned open. Footsteps echoed down the concrete corridor. Chief Garrett Monroe appeared on the other side of the iron bars, looking impeccably tailored in his dress uniform. Beside him stood Officer Colton Briggs, a fresh bandage over his knuckles and a smug, predatory grin plastered across his face. "Well, Mrs. Kane," Chief Monroe said, his voice dripping with condescension as he rested his hands on his duty belt. "You've had a very busy night. breaking and entering, destruction of property, theft of a firearm, and assaulting a police officer. You're looking at a minimum of 20 years in a state penitentiary. Your daughter is going to wake up an orphan, assuming she wakes up at all. Briggs leaned against the bars, chewing a piece of gum. I told you, lady, you should have just stayed out of it. We found your laptop. We smashed it to pieces. Whatever you thought you were doing, it's over. You lost. Vivian slowly raised her head. The exhaustion in her eyes was entirely eclipsed by a chilling, absolute calm. She looked at the clock mounted on the concrete wall above Monroe's head. I didn't lose, Garrett, Vivian whispered, her voice raspy but terrifyingly steady. And you didn't smash anything that mattered. You just destroyed the receipt. Monroe frowned, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his polished features. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that you have only moments left as a free man, Vivian replied, a bloody smile touching the corners of her lips. Before Monroe could respond, a thunderous crash shook the ceiling above them. It sounded like the entire front facade of the precinct had been breached. Alarms began to blare, a chaotic, shrieking siren that echoed down the stairwells. Heavy boots, dozens of them, were pounding down the concrete steps toward the holding cells. What the hell is that? Briggs barked, his hand instinctively dropping to his holster. The door to the cell block was kicked open with such force it shattered the reinforced glass window. Through the threshold poured a tidal wave of men and women in dark windbreakers and heavy tactical gear. The bright yellow letters FBI emblazoned across their chests. Behind them were heavily armed United States Marshals carrying assault rifles. Hands away from your weapons! Do it now! A voice roared over the din. Monroe froze, his face draining of all color. Briggs took one look at the federal agents pouring into the corridor and made a fatal miscalculation. He turned and sprinted toward the rear utility exit of the cell block. Suspect is running, a marshal shouted. A senior agent in a tailored suit stepped forward, ignoring the fleeing officer for the moment. This was Special Agent Marcus Hale of the FBI's Anti-Corruption Task Force. He walked straight up to Chief Monroe, whose hands were trembling so violently he could barely keep them at his sides. Garrett Monroe, Agent Hale said, his voice cutting through the ringing alarms. You are under arrest for racketeering, conspiracy to distribute narcotics, obstruction of justice, and violating the civil rights of Lila Kane under the color of law. Turn around and put your hands behind your back, Monroe stammered, looking around as if expecting his own officers to save him. But the few local cops present had already been disarmed and pushed against the walls by the feds. The chief of police was forcefully spun around, and the humiliating click of handcuffs echoed in the corridor. Agent Hale then turned to Vivian's cell. He pulled a master key ring from a confiscated guard and unlocked the heavy iron door. He stepped inside, his hardened expression softening into genuine respect. Vivian Kane? He asked gently. Yes, Elijah Grant sent us, ma'am, Agent Hale said, producing a small key to unlock the cuffs binding her bruised wrists. The Attorney General has personally federalized this building. You are free to go. We have a medical team waiting for you upstairs and an escort ready to take you back to the hospital. As the heavy steel cuffs fell to the floor, the true scale of the karma Vivian had unleashed began to manifest across the state. Colton Briggs had not made it far. Realizing the precinct was surrounded, he had managed to slip out through a storm drain grate, hijack a civilian's idling pickup truck, and make a desperate break for the county line. But the video had already been broadcast to every law enforcement database in the region. He was not intercepted by his own corrupt deputies. He was boxed in by a specialized tactical unit of state troopers, men who harbored a vicious, burning hatred for dirty cops who tarnished the badge. When Briggs's stolen truck was rammed into a concrete median on Interstate 95, he refused to surrender. Drunk on his own perceived invincibility, he kicked open his jammed door and reached for his backup weapon. The troopers did not hesitate. They unleashed a physical reckoning that mirrored the exact brutality Briggs had inflicted on Lila. They dragged his massive frame through the shattered window glass, throwing him face first onto the unforgiving asphalt. When he thrashed and threw a punch, a trooper drove a heavy knee squarely into Briggs's spine. By the time they dragged him up to read him his Miranda rights, his jaw was fractured in 3 places, his orbital bone was crushed, and his nose was shattered. The official federal arrest report would later cite injuries sustained while violently resisting a lawful apprehension. The irony was a bitter, poetic, and utterly satisfying justice. Meanwhile, downtown, Judge Everett Foley was in the middle of a televised sentencing hearing for a low-level drug offender, lecturing the young man on the sanctity of the law. The heavy mahogany doors of his courtroom flew open. 6 federal marshals marched straight down the center aisle, their boots echoing like gunshots against the hardwood floor. The gallery gasped. The bailiff stepped back, utterly powerless. Everett Foley, the lead marshal announced, projecting his voice so every microphone in the room picked it up. Step down from the bench. You are under arrest for money laundering, conspiracy to distribute Schedule I narcotics, and judicial corruption. Foley's arrogant facade completely collapsed. He practically fell out of his high-backed leather chair, his black robes tangling around his legs as the marshals hauled him to his feet. He wept openly, sobbing and begging as they slapped the irons on his wrists in front of the local news cameras. His assets were frozen immediately, his dummy corporation seized by the Treasury Department, and he was staring down the barrel of 2 consecutive life sentences in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Officer Travis Lang, the weak link, took the coward's way out. But the universe offered him no mercy. He surrendered immediately, offering to testify against Briggs, Monroe, and Foley in exchange for a lighter sentence. The federal prosecutors happily took his testimony, but they stripped him of his pension, revoked his badge, and handed him a mandatory 12-year federal bid. Because his income was proven to be tied to a criminal enterprise, the state seized his bank accounts. He lost the house. He lost the stolen money, and he lost his freedom, realizing too late that his complicity had destroyed the very family he was trying to save. The blue wall of silence had not just cracked. Vivian Kane had driven a nuclear warhead through it. Over 45 officers were suspended, indicted, or fired in the ensuing federal sweep. The mayor resigned in utter disgrace by midday. The Oakridge Police Department was placed under a federal consent decree, its leadership gutted and replaced. In the weeks that followed, the terrifying synthetic rhythm of the neurological intensive care unit finally changed. Vivian was sitting in the familiar vinyl chair beside the hospital bed. The bruises on her own face were fading into dull yellow shadows. She was holding a worn copy of Lila's favorite architecture textbook, reading aloud about the structural integrity of cantilever bridges, when she felt a faint, almost imperceptible pressure on her right hand. Vivian's breath hitched. She stopped reading. The book slipped from her lap and hit the linoleum floor with a soft thud. She looked down. Lila's fingers were twitching. "Lila?" Vivian whispered, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She stood up, leaning over the bed. "Baby, can you hear me?" Slowly, agonizingly, Lila's eyelids fluttered. The horrific swelling had subsided, revealing the beautiful, bright face Vivian thought she might never see again. The heavy breathing tube had been removed days ago, replaced by a simple nasal cannula. Lila's dark eyes, clouded with a heavy fog of medication and confusion, darted around the ceiling before finally locking onto her mother's face. A single tear slipped down Lila's cheek. She tried to speak, her voice a dry, broken rasp that sounded like sandpaper. "Mom?" Vivian completely broke. She collapsed forward, burying her face into the crook of her daughter's neck, sobbing with a profound, overwhelming, earth-shattering relief. It was the sound of a woman who had walked through the fires of hell and successfully dragged her child back into the light. "I'm here, baby," Vivian wept, pressing desperate kisses to Lila's forehead, her cheeks, her trembling hands. "I'm right here. You're safe now. I promise you you're safe. They can never, ever hurt you again." Lila managed a weak, exhausted squeeze of her mother's hand. Did they get away with it?" Vivian looked down at her beautiful, resilient daughter, the afternoon sun streaming through the hospital window to bathe them in a warm, golden glow. A fierce, protective pride settled deep in Vivian's chest. "No, my sweet girl." Vivian smiled, wiping the tears from her own cheeks. "Mommy made sure they lost everything." The story of Vivian Kane remains a towering testament to the terrifying, unstoppable force of a mother's love. When the very system designed to protect citizens transforms into a predatory syndicate, the average person is expected to bow down and accept defeat. Vivian refused to kneel. Armed with nothing but clinical precision, fierce intelligence, and an absolute refusal to let her daughter become a silent statistic, she single-handedly dismantled an entrenched, corrupted empire. The Oakridge Police Department believed they held all the power, failing to realize that true power does not reside in a badge or a gavel, but in the righteous fury of a parent defending their child. Lila Kane eventually recovered, walking out of that hospital to continue her architecture degree, building a future on the ashes of the corrupt men her mother burned to the ground. Justice, ultimately, was not served by the law. It was demanded by a mother.